Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the building of empires in the early modern period of world history. This will be our first topic of study in period 2, 1450 to 1750, and the title of Unit 3 is the land-based empires. This is not our first look at empires in world history. Recall, we have studied empires in pre-modern world history. Empires like the Umayyad and Abbasid empires, the Inca and Aztec empires, the Tang and Song empires, and the Malian and Mongolian empires. By 1450, these pre-modern empires had either ended or were close to their end. However, they set the historical example of empire building, and in their wake, a new era of land-based empires emerged. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of this learning objective. 1. Explain how and why various land-based empires developed and expanded from 1450 to 1750. Today, one would seldom describe the political landscape of our world to be one of a few great empires. Rather, we have a more complex global political landscape of 195 nations, in which some of those nations cooperate in military alliances and trade associations. Though some of these nations are larger, more powerful, and more ethnically diverse than others, one does not really refer to them as empires today, except in a situation where one is critically analyzing a nation's cultural or military actions that appear to be parallel to the actions of historical empires. Simply put, the accepted premise is that the nation state has overcome the empire in the contemporary world. As debatable as that claim certainly is, let's entertain that premise for the purpose of understanding empires in pre-modern and for some of modern world history. In a very simplistic definition, the word empire means an extensive group of states or countries under a single supreme authority. Perhaps the peoples living in those states or countries within an empire have very few differences. Perhaps those peoples share cultural aspects and traditions, more so than they differ in cultural aspects and traditions. It was possible that just the mere geographic location of one state compared to another state was enough of a significant reason to have two different states. Maybe the peoples of those two hypothetical states shared a common race, language, religious practice, system of writing, and other life ways, but the fact that their lands, cities, and resources were miles apart from each other necessitated the creation of two distinct states. More realistically, the myriad of states within an empire were much more different in their cultural traditions and characteristics. So, how did states with substantial geographic and cultural differences among themselves ultimately come together into a single empire? In essence, one could suggest that one or more of the many states or countries that make up an empire actually derive the single supreme authority that govern the rest of the empire. Additionally, that one or more states presumably had to expand their political and cultural influence and control over the neighboring states, and were somehow able to establish that control over an elongated period of time. For the purposes of this world history course, we will analyze empire in pre-modern and modern world history in three phases: the building phase, the maintenance phase, and the decline phase. In this particular presentation, we will focus on the building phase of some of the world's most successful land-based empires in early modern world history between 1450 and 1750. To begin, the building phase of empire contains three aspects that I feel are necessary conditions for empire to be achieved. First, of the many state-level polities within an empire, one of those states must have established a state-level cultural identity. This cultural identity must include the characteristics that make that particular state of people unique from any other state of people. For example, consider the characteristics that make a person or a population of people uniquely Greek, uniquely Roman, uniquely Chinese, uniquely German, or uniquely American. More analytically, consider the characteristics that make a person or a population of people uniquely Athenian or Spartan, uniquely Latin or Carthaginian, uniquely Han or Tibetan, uniquely German or Austrian, uniquely Texan or New Yorker. Those unique characteristics could include a particular language or dialect, religion, race, common ancestry, history of struggle, geographic location, values, mindsets, and worldviews. This list could go on, but the bottom line is that any of those distinct characteristics could essentially be enough to create a distinct state-level cultural identity. Once that state-level cultural identity is achieved, like I am an Athenian and you're a Spartan, so we both have our own separate state-level cultural identity, the next part of this condition for empire is a state-level cultural identity must be viewed as superior to any different cultural identity. A connection between the individual and the state-level cultural identity has to be established to the point that an individual may take pride or responsibility in that state-level cultural identity. For a Roman to see Carthaginian identity as inferior was necessary for the Roman military to do what it did to Carthage in the Third Punic War, when it brutally conquered the city in 146 BCE. Likewise, a Mongolian had to recognize his cultural identity to be superior to that of a Chinese individual in order for a Mongolian military to do what it did in its conquest of China during the 13th century CE. A German would have had to have bought into his cultural identity's superiority for him and his fellow Germans to do what they did to the non-German peoples of Europe prior to and during World War II. If each of these different states viewed their state-level cultural identities as equals, perhaps they would have aligned with each other, or merely traded with each other, or at the very least, they would have found more equitable ways of coexistence. But to extend one state's dominance over another, one state had to view itself as superior to the other, and then take a chance at dominating the other states. A second condition to the building phase of empire is the establishment of a unified state-level culture that has a centralized government that has sovereignty over its population. Like when Genghis Khan brought all the Mongolian tribes under his unified rule and then centralized his power at Karakorum, the Mongols had achieved the second condition of empire building. This condition of a culture achieving a unified and centralized government that has sovereignty over its population is what gives that culture the ability to enact its superiority complex against others. Rather than the Mongolian tribes to continue to fight each other, Genghis Khan's unification and centralization of a single Mongolian state enabled the Mongols to shift their day-to-day agenda from surviving battles with each other to building a Mongolian empire. Consider the historical characteristics that could have possibly kept a state from being unified and centralized. Perhaps political factionalism and infighting, revolts and civil wars, rival leadership, or worse yet, opposing football clubs could have been enough to keep a state from remaining unified and centralized. The third condition to the building phase of empire is the expansion of that unified and centralized state. The neighboring states who are deemed inferior to the dominant state will come under the dominant state's control through multiple methods of expansion. For the Mongols, the preferred method was brutal military conquest. Let's face it, Most of our pre-modern empires in world history expanded via militant conquest. The Chinese, the Indian, the Hellenistic, the Roman, and the Mongolian empires utilized their militaries to gain substantial territory and populations. Even in modern world history, the Spanish, the British, and the Americans all used military conquest to build their empires. Other methods, such as land purchases, colonization and resettlement of peoples, or treaties and land acquisitions, are all examples of how pre-modern and modern states expanded their territorial control. It was the benefits and exploits of expanding into neighboring and sometimes distant peoples and territories that drove expansion. It may have been for arable land and fertile land, resource-rich land, access and choke points, coastal lands, and prosperous populations in dense urban centers that drove a centralized and unified state to expand. Whatever the motivating factors were for a state to expand, the act of expansion garnered that state access to an environmental mosaic that yielded great economic benefit. The best examples of the building of land-based empires in the early modern period were the Qing dynasty in China and its neighboring populations and territories, the Mughal Empire in India and its neighboring populations and territories, the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia and its neighboring populations and territories, and the Safavid Empire in Iran and its neighboring populations and territories. Our first example of a land-based empire in the early modern period was China, the Qing dynasty. China had been the most influential and longest sustained civilization in the Far East. With the exception of the Mongolian conquests in the late post-classical period, Chinese civilized traditions of agriculture, political centrality, imperial expansion, Confucianism, technological and intellectual advancement, and patriarchal and hierarchical practices greatly Sinicized the non-Chinese peoples of the Far East. Again, the Mongols, who temporarily came to dominate China from the late 13th century to the late 14th century, were the exception, as they successfully retained their Mongolian identity as they overcame Chinese civilization. Similar to the Mongols, the people living in Manchuria had long been able to protect their Manchu identity from being Sinicized. The Manchu were predominantly a nomadic or semi-nomadic people who were known for their equestrian and cavalry skills, as well as their archery skills. In essence, the Manchu were really just another non-Chinese barbaric people who posed a threat to the civility of the Chinese people. Quite possibly in the Ming dynasty, the native Chinese dynasty that followed the Mongolian period and ruled China from 1368 until 1644, built up its defenses and expanded the Great Wall to their northeast, then perhaps they could have spared themselves from the reality of that Manchu military threat. As it happened, the Manchu invaded northern China and established a permanent state that worked hard to protect Manchu identity. For example, Manchu leaders and their soldiers were adorned with the queue, a hairstyle in which the front of the head is shaven bald, but the back of the head has long hair that was typically braided into a tail. In fact, as the Manchu intensified their control over China, they enacted the queue policy over the Chinese males as a sign of dominance. Additionally, the Manchu enacted segregationist policies that were similar to Mongolian segregationist policies from the post-classical period. One of those policies included forbidding intermarriage between Manchu and Chinese peoples to ensure the Manchu would not be completely Sinicized. In essence, the Manchu saw their cultural identity as superior to that of the Chinese cultural identity and looked to protect their own identity in the process. However, in part, the Manchu did assimilate into Chinese culture and traditions. For example, they adopted Chinese practices of patriarchy, hierarchy, Confucianism, and agriculture. Manchuria, a land north of the Korean peninsula and northeast of China, had been a land under Jurchen control during the reign of both the Mongolian Yuan dynasty and the Chinese Ming dynasty. The Jurchens were a non-Chinese nomadic peoples who at one point established a powerful state in northern China prior to the Mongolian invasions in the post-classical period. The Jurchens that were resettled into northern China came under Mongolian Yuan dynastic and Chinese Ming dynastic control in the latter end of the post-classical period. However, those Jurchens that lived in Manchuria retained their political independence and their political divisiveness. The Jurchen tribes to the northeast of China, known as the Manchu tribes, had many political similarities to the Mongols, in that the tribes were politically divided. In the early modern period, the Manchu tribes underwent a similar political change as the Mongols had experienced earlier in the post-classical period. The Manchu tribal leader, Nurhaci, forced the unification of all the Manchu tribes during the early 17th century. Following some of the methods as the Mongolian leader Genghis Khan, Nurhaci developed a strong and unified Manchu state that was really a unification of all tribal military forces. Nurhaci's military organization became known as the Banner System. The Banner System's bannermen, or Manchu warriors, were skilled in many of the same military practices as the Mongols had been. As Ming China faced environmental, demographic, economic, and political decline, Nurhaci's bannermen began the invasion of northern China. Within 3 decades of Nurhaci's invasions of northern China, the Ming dynasty would be ousted from power. In the wake of the Ming's overthrow, the capital city of Beijing and the impressive Forbidden City, the former imperial palace of the Ming dynasty, became the point of political centrality for a new Manchu-led dynasty in China, the Qing dynasty. Established in 1644, the Qing dynasty would retain control over China and nearby territories and peoples until its overthrow in 1911. Early modern China really squandered its own potential at becoming a transoceanic maritime empire during the 15th century. After the reign of the Ming dynasty's Emperor Yongle, the Ming's successors revoked the royal financing of long-distance oceanic voyages. The dominance and the prestige of Admiral Zheng He's fleet of massive junk ships in the Indian Ocean complex disappeared after Emperor Yonglu's reign, and the Ming dynasty opted to focus on its continuous land expansion throughout Central and East Asia. With the Manchu invasions and subsequent overthrow of the Ming dynasty, the newly formed Qing dynasty would continue down the path of a land-based empire throughout the early modern period. The Chinese, who during the late Ming dynasty opted to commit to being a terrestrial people, and the Manchu, who had long been a terrestrial people, combined their landed imperialistic ways, and over the next few centuries built one of the largest land-based empires in world history. For the Qing dynasty, expansion was a means to continuously defend conquered territory and strengthen political and military positioning in nearby lands that hosted non-Chinese and non-Manchu peoples. For the Qing to show their military dominance to Tibetan and Mongolian peoples on the periphery of the Chinese Empire was to ensure their longevity as a formidable empire in the early modern period. One of the greatest emperors of the Qing dynasty, and in all of Chinese history, was Emperor Kongzhi, who ruled over China for 61 years between 1661 to 1722. Kongzhi amassed such a powerful army that he was able to bring Vietnam, Inner Mongolia, Tibet, the island of Taiwan, into the Qing dynasty's imperial control. Additionally, Kongzhi was able to settle territorial disputes between his Qing dynasty and the encroaching Russian Empire to the north. Kongzhi's grandson, Emperor Qianlong, would also expand the Qing dynasty's imperial control. Qianlong, who also ruled for 61 years between 1735 and 1796 increased the Qing dynasty's territorial rule in Central Asia. His bannermen expanded into Outer Mongolia, Tibet, and other Central Asian lands that included the modern-day nations of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Ultimately, the Qing dynasty was able to build an environmental mosaic, as it controlled the fertile and arable lands of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in China, the Pacific coastal regions from the Sea of Japan to the South China Sea, and the steppe lands of Central Asia from the southern borders of the Russian Empire to the northern borders of the Mughal Empire in India. Our second example of a land-based empire from the early modern period was India, the Mughal Empire. Like the Manchu, who had their origin in the rugged terrain of Manchuria and moved south to conquer China during the 17th century, earlier the Turkic Mongolian peoples of the rugged terrain of Central Asia moved south to conquer India during the 16th century. This Turkic Mongolian group of people came from the modern nation of Uzbekistan in Central Asia. This group was predominantly a Sunni Muslim group whose ancestors had long converted to Islam, but the land they originated from was the rugged and arid steppe lands. These Turkic Mongols were a pastoralist peoples who lived in yurts and fended for themselves off the deficient steppe lands and the secondary products taken from their horses and animals. They were the direct descendants of the late 14th century Uzbek leader Timur the Lame, the last of the great post-classical era pastoralist conquerors, who envisioned himself as the sequel to the late 12th and early 13th century Mongolian leader Genghis Khan. With these qualities comprised in their cultural identity, these Uzbek Turkic Mongols saw themselves as the progeny of great empire builders, and they set their eyes on the civilizations to the south to begin their process of empire building. Having that Turkic Mongolian cultural identity was not enough for the tribes and small principalities in Uzbekistan to unite. As in the earlier cases of Timur and Genghis Khan, tribal division and even family and kinship rivalry inhibited political unity and centrality. The leader that will emerge out of the divided political landscape of 16th century Uzbekistan will be Babur, the tiger. Babur was the great-great-grandson of Timur, but unlike Timur, Babur had a hard time establishing himself as the sole leader of the tribes of Uzbekistan. In fact, on 3 separate occasions, Babur attempted to forcibly bring the Uzbek city of Samarkand out from under the control of some of his relatives and bring it under his own control. Each of those attempts ultimately failed to secure the city under Babur's rule. So, instead of being the great unifier of the peoples of Uzbekistan, Babur headed south and took refuge in modern-day Afghanistan. It was at the city of Kabul where his fellow Turkic Mongolian refugees and many other pastoralist peoples would proclaim their allegiance to Babur. Unable to establish a unified and centralized government at Samarkand, Babur would achieve this condition of empire building in Kabul by inaugurating the Mughal dynasty, merely 600 miles north of the Indian city Delhi. Eventually, the capital of the Mughal dynasty would move south to Fatehpur Sikri, and as well as Agra in India. Mughal was a Turkic Mongolian pronunciation of the word Mongol, and like the Mongols, who had been instrumental in the diffusion of gunpowder in the late post-classical period, the Mughal Empire would utilize gunpowder to their advantage. In fact, historians refer to the Mughal Empire as one of the 3 gunpowder empires. The other 2 gunpowder empires are the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. Equipped with siege cannons, Babur entered northern India with a relatively small division of soldiers. At the First Battle of Panipat in 1526, Babur's field artillery was too much for the last of the sultans of the Delhi Sultanate. Military victory after victory enabled Babur and his Mughal military to move to the northeastern portion of India. Babur's grandson, Akbar the Great, who ruled the Mughal Empire from 1556 until his death in 1605, expanded beyond his grandfather's acquired territories. Akbar's military utilized handheld matchlock guns, which greatly influenced his ability to extend Mughal rule from the Arabian Sea in the west to the Bay of Bengal in the east, and included the region of Sindh in modern-day Pakistan, the Gujarat region of modern-day India, and eastern territories in modern-day Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. However, the greatest extent of this Mughal environmental mosaic came from the conquests of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 until 1707. Aurangzeb was the great-grandson of Akbar the Great, and, like his great-grandfather, he utilized advancements in gunpowder to secure the lands south of the Deccan Plateau in India. Our third example of a land-based empire from the early modern period was in the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and North Africa, the Ottoman Empire. As you may recall, Turkish peoples migrated out of their homeland of Central Asia during the post-classical period. Some Turks headed south, as in the case of Mahmud of Ghazni and the Ghaznavid Turks, who ultimately founded the Sultanate of Delhi in northern India. Other tribes of Turks headed west toward the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire in the post-classical period. Though tribal affiliations made up the most immediate cultural identity for Turkish peoples, some common qualities among the Turkish tribes were present. For example, the Turks have common pastoralist and semi-nomadic lifeways that were established firmly in the arduous steppe lands of Central Asia. Though many of the Turks were taken out of the steppe lands were never completely taken out of the Turks. Like the Mongols from post-classical times, the Turks were characterized as horse people with an uncanny mobility and maneuverability. The Turks had their own language, Turkish. Additionally, many of the Turkish peoples had long gravitated toward the religion of Islam, Sunni Islam specifically. So by the time of the early modern period, these qualities are what distinguished Turkish peoples from non-Turkish peoples. And it was these qualities that Turkish peoples saw as superior to the non-Turkish peoples and civilizations they ultimately conquered. The settlement patterns of the Turks that moved westward were just as divided as their preceding migratory patterns. Turkish peoples who settled near and in Abbasid and Byzantine territory founded small states and principalities, known as beyliks. For example, the Seljuk Turks were some of the first Turks to establish beyliks in Southwest Asia, as early as the 9th and 10th centuries in the middle of the post-classical period. Other Turkish groups followed suit, and in the late post-classical period, many beyliks were settled in Anatolia, after the Abbasid Caliphate was defeated and during the time the Byzantine Empire's decline. Even with the presence of Christian crusaders in Southwest Asia, the number of beyliks continued to increase. By approximately 1300 CE, the Byzantines were near completely pushed out of Anatolia across the Bosporus, the strait that divides the city of Constantinople and ultimately divides the continents of Europe and Asia, and connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. At that point, the strongest and most aggressive beylik was the Osman Beylik in the northwestern portion of Anatolia. The leader of this beylik was Osman Bey, who went to great lengths to strengthen his beylik's position in Anatolia by forcing some of the other beyliks under his control. Though Osman did not unify all of the beyliks of Anatolia, he laid the foundation for unification and centralization for the beyliks. Osman's control of numerous beyliks in Anatolia established the foundation for the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Sultan who finalized the unification of the beyliks of Anatolia was Mehmed II, whose armies defeated the Byzantines, conquered Constantinople, and established the city as their point of political centrality in 1453. In the wake of the Byzantine defeat, the Ottoman Turks would rename Constantinople to Istanbul, the modern capital of the nation of Turkey. The Ottoman Empire expanded greatly throughout the 16th century. As early as 1514, Ottoman Sultan Selim I utilizes gunpowder-based military to defeat the Safavid Empire at the Battle of Chaldiran, near the modern border between Iran and Azerbaijan. This victory brought eastern Anatolia and northern Iraq under Ottoman control. Additionally, in 1517, Selim expanded the Ottoman Empire into Arabia. His expansion brought the cities of Medina and Mecca under Ottoman protection. In the face of European arrival in Southwest Asia, many Arab populations appealed to Selim and the Ottomans to protect the holiest sites of Islam. Selim also mobilized his military across the Red Sea and brought Mamluk Egypt under Ottoman control. Selim's son, Suleiman, later known as Suleiman the Magnificent, was the Ottoman Sultan who expanded the Ottoman Empire to its greatest extent. Reigning from 1520 to 1566, Suleiman mobilized his armies against populations in Southeast Europe and Central Asia. In addition to Suleiman's gunpowder-based military, he also worked to expand the Ottoman navy. Recall, the Turks were traditionally a horse and terrestrial people. However, Suleiman launched attacks through the eastern Mediterranean Sea and posed a real threat of an Islamic takeover of Christian Europe. Suleiman also utilized a system of tribute, known as the Devshirme, in order to take Christian boys from the Christian societies he governed in southeastern Europe and make them into soldiers. These boys were converted to Islam, trained with Ottoman weaponry, and placed in Suleiman's elite fighting force known as the Janissaries. The Janissaries were the most feared division of the Ottoman military, especially in their campaigns against Austria and Hungary in Southeast Europe. Suleiman's army got as far west as the Austrian city of Vienna and held it under siege for over a month in the year 1529. This would spark several centuries of turmoil between the Habsburg Empire of Austria and the Ottoman Empire. In essence, the environmental mosaic of the Ottoman Empire was complete, as they controlled most of North Africa, Southwest Asia, Southeast Europe, and more than half of the Mediterranean Sea. The fourth example of a land-based empire from the early modern period was in Central Asia, the Safavid Empire. One quality of a cultural or national identity can be the common history of struggle that a people has endured over generations. For example, when European Jews sought the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel after World War II, one of their major claims was the common history of struggle that Jews had faced for centuries under various European governments. In essence, when many Jews felt that they were a nationless people, and because of that, the nations they resided in did not prioritize nor protect them, and at certain points those nations' governments targeted them. The peoples of Iran and Central Asia after 1450 had a common history of struggle. That common history of struggle involved non-Iranian peoples governing over Iranian peoples inside of Iranian lands. For example, since the 7th century CE and the Arab-Muslim Umayyad Caliphate's conquest of Iran, through the reign of the Abbasid Caliphate in Iran, and then the Mongolian Ilkhanates that reigned over Iran, Iranian peoples had a long post-classical history of struggle for independence and self-determination. At the turn of the 16th century, this desire for self-determination was coupled with the Iranian people's gravitation toward the Shia sect of Islam. The foreign Arab and Mongolian states that governed Iranian peoples had long declared their commitment to the Sunni sect of Islam. Additionally, the Turkish peoples surrounding Iran in Central Asia had also long committed the Sunni sect. In essence, these two qualities of a common history of struggle and the adoption of the Shia sect of Islam fueled the sense of a superior cultural identity within the Iranian peoples. Iranian peoples, much like the other Persian and Turkish peoples around them, had lived in divided tribal affiliations. The great unifier of the Iranian tribes would be Shah Ismail I, who would be recognized as the Shah of Iran and the leader of the Safavid dynasty. Though many of the rival Iranian tribes accepted Ismail's terms of unity, not all of the tribes did so. In effect, Ismail and his alliance of northwestern Iranian tribes quickly defeated the remaining rival tribes of Iran and in the nearby areas of Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia. Having promoted himself as the 12th Imam, a reincarnation of Muhammad, and the Mahdi, Ismail brought the Iranian peoples under this Twelver Shi'ism religion, and then centralized the Safavid Empire's government at the city of Tabriz in northwestern Iran in 1501. The Safavid Empire would reign until its defeat in 1736, and during those 2 centuries, the Safavid capital would be moved to the Iranian city of Isfahan. Shah Ismail I was a very successful conqueror of the peoples and lands in and near Iran. In fact, at the end of his initial campaigns, Ismail had acquired territory from the southern coast of the Caspian Sea to the northern coast of the Persian Gulf, and included the island city of Ormuz. Ismail made a lofty attempt at battling the Ottoman Empire in northwestern Iran at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. And although Ismail's soldiers were disciplined and well trained, they were not capable of defeating the Ottomans. At the time, the elite fighting force of the Safavid Empire was the Qizilbash, an Iranian military with precision archers and expert cavalrymen. The problem with the Qizilbash, by the time of the Battle of Chaldiran, was that the Ottomans had long transitioned to the use of gunpowder, whereas the Qizilbash found the use of gunpowder to be unmanly and had refused to reform themselves. After the defeat at Chaldiran, Ismail's successors would reform their military by adopting gunpowder, so as to defend Safavid territory and, in some cases, reconquer territories they had lost in battle. Shah Abbas the Great, who reigned from 1588 to 1629, was most instrumental in reforming the military and equipping his soldiers with firearms. He was also successful in restoring many of the Safavids' lost territories after successful campaigns against the Ottoman and Mughal empires. Abbas the Great also moved the capital of the Safavid Empire from Tabriz to Isfahan. Ultimately, the Safavid Empire eclipsed an environmental mosaic by controlling all of Central Asia, coastal regions to the south that granted them access to the Indian Ocean complex, coastal regions to the north that granted them access to the Caspian Sea, and fertile lands of Mesopotamia. Other land-based empires emerged during the early modern period, beyond the ones previously described. For example, in West Africa, the Songhai Empire came to replace the once powerful Malian Empire. Established by Sunni Ali, the Songhai Empire reigned from 1464 to 1591 and controlled West African lands from the Atlantic coast in the modern-day nations of Gambia and Senegal to the east in the modern-day nations of Niger and Nigeria, and much of the Niger River Valley. Sunni Ali and his successors promoted Islam as their empire's state religion, and continued to economically benefit from the gold and salt trades that occurred through the Trans-Sahara trade with North Africa. Another example of a land-based empire that established itself in the early modern period was the Russian Empire. Russian peoples had spent more than 2 centuries under the rule of the Mongolian Golden Horde, The Muscovite Prince Ivan III, later known as Ivan the Great, successfully overthrew the Golden Horde and established an independent Russian state with its headquarters at the city of Moscow. Ivan the Great began to gather the land that he believed rightfully belonged to the Russian state, predominantly lands that are part of the modern nation of Ukraine. His grandson, Ivan IV, otherwise known as Ivan the Terrible, also sought to expand Russia's territory by taking lands east of the Ural Mountains and establishing Russian control of some Caspian and Black Sea ports to the south. The greatest imperial expansion of Russia came during the reign of the Romanov dynasty. Established in 1613 by Michael I, the Romanovs would rule the Russian Empire until the dynasty was overthrown by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. During Michael's reign, the Russian Empire would conquer most of Siberia, the eastern portion of the modern-day nation of Russia. Michael's grandson, Peter I, later known as Peter the Great, worked to expand Russia's territory westward. His armies acquired more warm water ports in the Black Sea and Baltic Seas, and he had the city of St. Petersburg constructed as his window to the west. St. Petersburg would serve as the capital of the Russian Empire from the early 1700s until the end of the Romanov dynasty. Peter also commissioned Vitus Bering to navigate the northeast portion of Asia. After Peter's death, Bering navigated the waterway that connects the Pacific Ocean with the Arctic Ocean and divides Asia and North America. Bering's navigation in the early 18th century led to Russia's expansion into the modern American state of Alaska.